Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Now, the full title of this novel is actually Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. However, most people today just simply refer to it as Frankenstein. Now, if you've been following my channel for a number of years, you would know that this is actually the third review on this book that I've done on this channel. I first reviewed Frankenstein back in 2012, but that review sucked, so I redid it in 2016, and my 2016 review of Frankenstein is actually still up. However, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but I'll leave a link in the description below to where you could check out my 2016 review of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, the way this video is going to be structured is the first half is going to be me talking about the actual novel, then I'm going to cut to some friends of mine who have also read this book, giving their thoughts on this classic horror novel, and then in the second half of the video, it's going to be me talking about the various different film adaptations of Frankenstein, for which there are many, and very few of them actually really follow the book at all. Now, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus was first published anonymously in 1818. Now, I'm not sure if this is the actual reason it was published anonymously, but I know a lot of works written by women around this time were published anonymously because I guess at this time, since women unfortunately did not have a very high status in society, I guess a lot of ignorant people working in the publishing world must have thought, oh, nobody would be able to take this work seriously if they knew it was written by a woman. But it was republished under Shelley's actual name in 1821, and a revised edition of the novel was published in 1831, which is the edition of the novel that I read. Now, I've never read the original 1818 edition of Frankenstein, so I can't speak to what some of the major differences between the 1831 edition and the 1818 edition are. The only difference that I'm really familiar with is apparently in the original version of this novel, Elizabeth, Frankenstein's fiancée, is actually Frankenstein's cousin, whereas in the 1831 edition, even though Frankenstein still refers to her as his cousin, she's actually somebody who was adopted by the Frankenstein family, which is still a little eyebrow-raising considering that she's technically Frankenstein's adopted sister, and yet she still becomes his fiancée. Now, Mary Shelley, who was born Mary Godwin, was the daughter of political philosopher William Godwin and feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. I think I'm saying her last name right, but I'm not sure. Now, her mother actually died not too long after giving birth to her, and William Godwin would go on to marry Mary Jane Clairmont, of whom Mary Shelley would come to have a contentious relationship with. Now, in the summer of 1816, when Mary Godwin was 18 going on 19, her and her soon-to-be husband, Percy Shelley, and her stepsister, Claire Clairmont, and author John William Polidori spent the summer at Lake Geneva at the home of George Gordon Byron, better known as Lord Byron. And during that summer, I think it was Lord Byron who suggested that they pass the time with a ghost story contest. Who could tell the scariest ghost story? So it was during that summer where Mary Shelley conceived the idea of and started working on Frankenstein, which has come to be known as her magnum opus. Also, out of this ghost story contest came John William Polidori's short story, The Vampire, which is widely considered to be the first piece of vampire literature and was one of the primary sources of inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, it's interesting to note that there actually is a Castle Frankenstein in Germany, which some people believe is where Mary Shelley got the name Frankenstein. However, that's never actually been confirmed. Now, in the 17th century, there was a German alchemist named Johann Conrad Dippel, who was actually born in Castle Frankenstein, and some people believe that this guy was the inspiration for the character Victor Frankenstein. However, again, that's never actually been confirmed. At least I don't think it's ever been confirmed in any of Mary Shelley's notes or letters. Now, Frankenstein is one of my top 15 favorite books of all time. I think it is a remarkable piece of literature. And there's definitely a reason why this novel is still read and talked about even 200 years after it was written, because it touches on so many universal themes that are still very much relevant in the 21st century. Now, of course, everybody knows the story of Frankenstein. Even people who have never read this book know the story and they know the name Frankenstein, but people who haven't read the book, I don't think realize just how deep and philosophical this novel actually is, and just how tragic and really moving this story actually is. It's a story about science gone wrong and what happens when man tries to emulate God. It's also a story about the consequences of not taking responsibility for your own actions. It's a story about the dangers of obsession and about how revenge can corrupt the soul. It's also a story about abandonment, loneliness, and isolation, and ultimately it's a story about the cruelty of society and about social injustice to a certain extent. Now, Frankenstein was definitely a very original book for its time, but Mary Shelley definitely takes a lot of stuff from theology and mythology and other works of literature. Of course, the subtitle of the novel, The Modern Prometheus, is a reference to the Greek myth of Prometheus. Prometheus, according to Greek myth, was one of the titans who actually created mankind and tried to give the fire of the gods to mankind, but was punished by Zeus because of this. And here you have a story about a man who tries to become the human equivalent of a god, and this is ultimately his downfall. There's also a lot of elements of Faust in Frankenstein. There's elements of the Golem myth. But the book that I think had the biggest influence on Frankenstein was the 17th century epic poem Paradise Lost by John Milton. Now, I'll talk more about the connections between Frankenstein and Paradise Lost later on in this video. Now, what the plot of Frankenstein is, it begins where this captain named Robert Walton and his crew are on a voyage to the North Pole, and they end up coming across this man on the ice. This man is pretty much at death's door, and they take him aboard and nurse him back to health. Eventually, Captain Walton and this man become friends, and this man reveals that his name is Victor Frankenstein, and he is in the Arctic pursuing an enemy. And eventually, Frankenstein tells Walton his story, and the majority of the novel is Frankenstein's narrative. So, in the book, you find out that Frankenstein was a young student of science and philosophy, and following the death of his mother, he became obsessed with the concept of life and death, and particularly what creates life. Like, he became obsessed with finding the origin of life, and he ultimately tried to create life himself. So, eventually Frankenstein ended up creating a living being, but this did not turn out the way he wanted it to, and he was so horrified by what he has created that he abandons his creature outright and leaves it to fend for itself. So, close to a year or two goes by since he has created this creature, and he finally returns home only to discover that his younger brother William has been murdered, and the Frankenstein's maid, a young girl named Justine, has been accused of the crime. And Frankenstein knows that it was his creation who committed the murder, but he can't say anything because he knows nobody will believe him, and he also doesn't really want to admit what he's done. Eventually, Frankenstein is confronted by this creature that he created, who you find out in the time since Frankenstein abandoned him has taught himself how to speak and read and has become highly intelligent, even intellectual, but he has been rejected by society due to his physical appearance. And he has come to hate his own existence, and now vows revenge against his creator, so he threatens to destroy Frankenstein's family unless Frankenstein can create for him a female counterpart. Essentially an Eve to his Adam. Now, if I were to have a criticism of Frankenstein, I would say that, with the exception of Frankenstein himself and the creature, some of the side characters in this novel are a little two-dimensional. two-dimensional. One character who definitely stands out is the character of Henry Clerval, Frankenstein's best friend, who is a very likable character in terms of his love and loyalty towards Victor, and in a lot of ways he does sort of represent the compassion that Victor lacks. But unfortunately, while the character is likable, he is fairly two-dimensional. The same would go for Frankenstein's fiancée, Elizabeth, who is technically also his adopted sister, or cousin, as he calls her, which is a little weird, but we have to keep in mind that the story is taking place in a time when something like that wasn't as taboo as it is now. Now, there's no actual blood relation between her and Victor, but the fact that they did grow up together as brother and sister does make it a little eyebrow-raising that they end up marrying each other as adults. But again, Elizabeth is a relatively two-dimensional character, but Mary Shelley does try to make her a little bit more than just Victor's love interest in the story. Like, she does try to make her her own character. Especially in the scenes dealing with Justine's trial, where she's really the only one coming to Justine's defense. But the character of Justine, while being relatively two-dimensional, is actually a really important character in the story, and is actually a pretty underrated character from this novel. But all this stuff dealing with her trial for this murder that she did not commit, it's just so sad and so heartbreaking. And you can tell that it really affects Victor because her trial and ultimately her execution is technically Victor's fault, the same way that the murder of his younger brother was also his fault as well. Now, I find the relationship between Frankenstein and his creature to be one of the most interesting and complex hero-slash-villain relationships in literature. Now, in theory, Frankenstein is the protagonist of the story and the creature is the antagonist, but it's not as black and white as that. Because in a lot of ways, Frankenstein is also the villain of the story, because everything that happens is Frankenstein's fault. When he first created this creature, if he was so reviled by it, he should have destroyed it, but the fact that he didn't, he had a responsibility to this creature. Essentially, the creature was his son. It was his illegitimate child. And it was his abandonment of this creature that made him a villain. And the creature is definitely the most compelling character in the novel, I think, where, yes, he is the villain of the story, yet there's a certain point where he tells Frankenstein what happened to him after he was first created, and the narrative really switches to the creature, and it's the creature who narrates the book for a certain portion of it, and at that point, the creature really is kind of the protagonist. And you do genuinely sympathize with the creature in the beginning of his narrative, where you realize he was this innocent, misunderstood creature who was mistreated by people around him simply because he looked like a monster. But there was a certain point where he hid out in this shed by the home of this family called the Delanceys, who you find out in the story were also the victims of injustice, and he actually learned how to speak by observing this family, and he ended up helping this family almost as a secret guardian angel. And then he found these books and taught himself how to read and became highly intelligent, but ultimately this family ended up rejecting him, thinking he was a monster. And it was people treating him like a monster that ultimately made him the monster they thought he was. Now, the creature does genuinely go too far when he murders William Frankenstein and then frames Justine for it, but you understand what led him to that point. And really, it's a story about the dangers of obsession. Frankenstein became so obsessed with creating life that it ultimately destroyed him and his entire family, and the creature became so obsessed with getting revenge on his creator that it destroyed his innocence and destroyed his soul. And eventually, Frankenstein becomes obsessed with getting revenge on his creature, and it becomes a cat and mouse game between these two characters, characters, and really it's their own egos, and both of them refusing to see the other one's point of view that ultimately destroys both of them. So obsession and revenge are two major themes in the story, and you also see the parallels between Frankenstein and Captain Walton, where is this quest for the North Pole ultimately gonna be Captain Walton's downfall? Now, one of the books that the creature ends up reading is John Milton's Paradise Lost, which was a retelling of the biblical story of Adam and Eve, but it mainly focused on Satan's role in Adam and Eve's fall from grace, and it was largely told from Lucifer's perspective. And many critics have interpreted John Milton's version of Satan not necessarily as the villain of Paradise Lost, but rather as a tragic hero, as sort of this romantic figure of rebellion. And when the creature reads Paradise Lost, he compares himself to Adam, but then ultimately compares himself to Satan, the angel who is cast out. And Paradise Lost is really important to the theme of the story of man playing God, where Frankenstein was a man who wanted to be like God, and he ultimately got his wish. He created an Adam, and has the potential at one point to create an Eve, but he neglects the fact that God has an enemy, Satan, and that's essentially what the creature becomes to him. The creature becomes his Satan, his fallen angel. And this whole idea of the monster essentially being a fallen angel is also reflected in the whole subplot with the Delancey family, where he actually does look at this family as being almost like gods because they're part of the same species that created him. And when he starts secretly helping them out, he essentially becomes their guardian angel, but when they cast him out, when they reject him, he becomes their fallen angel. And Frankenstein himself also comes to reflect Adam and Eve and Satan to a certain extent, where, like Adam, Frankenstein tried to achieve this forbidden knowledge, and it's ultimately what destroyed him and doomed his entire family. The same way that Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge is what cursed mankind, according to the biblical story. And like Satan, Frankenstein thought he had a right to be on equal footing with God and create life himself, and this is ultimately what condemned him to a hell of his own creation. Now, it's interesting to note that in the novel, you never actually find out how Frankenstein gave life to this creature. You know, he made the body by stitching together the remains of different dead bodies, but you never actually find out how he brought the creature to life. All this stuff about bringing the creature to life using electricity is something added for the adaptations. But if you take into account that the creature is essentially a reanimated corpse, you can see some parallels with the story of Lazarus from the Bible. And again, it's this whole idea of Frankenstein being a man who wishes he was God and ultimately gets his wish. Now, being that this book was written by a woman, some critics have read sort of a feminist undercurrent to it, which I could definitely see a little bit. Like, you could say that the book is sort of a criticism of male ego and this idea of men trying to be above nature and the consequences of man's conquest of nature. Now, there are some aspects of Mary Shelley's life that might have informed this story a little bit. Like, some people believe that Frankenstein was also loosely based on Mary's father, William Godwin, because Mary did have a very complicated relationship with her father, and some critics have seen some aspects of Percy Shelley in Frankenstein. Now, it's interesting to note that when Mary Godwin and Percy Shelley first started their relationship, Percy Shelley was already married to another woman, and he left her for Mary Godwin. This woman ended up killing herself and their unborn child. And I can imagine that Mary Shelley probably felt some guilt over that, and perhaps that guilt also informs Frankenstein. Now, Frankenstein was a major bestseller when it was first published, and Mary Shelley would go on to write other novels, but unfortunately her other novels never had quite the same impact as Frankenstein. Now, perhaps her second most famous novel would be a book called The Last Man, which is sort of an early example of the post-apocalyptic genre. Now, I listen to music a lot when I read, and if you do too, I highly recommend listening to the album The Things We Think We're Missing by Balance and Composure while reading Frankenstein. There are two songs in particular off that album that really do kind of reflect the themes of the novel, or at least reflect the struggle between Frankenstein and his creature. One is the song Enemy, and the other is the song Reflection. And yes, I'm sure neither of those songs were actually written about Frankenstein, but they do kind of remind me of some of the themes of Frankenstein. But yeah, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley is just an amazing novel, and there's a reason this book has stood the test of time and will continue to stand the test of time. And this book, especially in the 20th and 21st century, has become kind of prophetic in ways I don't think Mary Shelley could have ever predicted. Like today, doctors can resuscitate people, they could perform organ transplants or give you an artificial heart, and obviously that's not a bad thing. That is an example of science benefiting mankind, and I do think that's one of the major points of the novel, is that science should always be there to better mankind, but never to satisfy the personal hubris of the individual scientist. And today you also have cloning and genetic engineering, and honestly, artificial intelligence might not be that far off. But science has also led us astray, especially with things like the creation of the atomic bomb or mishandling of nuclear power like Chernobyl or the Fukushima nuclear meltdown of 2011. And those recent events definitely call to mind one of the major themes of Frankenstein, that man needs to be careful in his scientific ambition. Now I want to cut to my friends giving their thoughts on Frankenstein. When it cuts back to me, I'm going to be talking about the various adaptations of this novel, very few of which have actually followed the book.
So, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. What are my thoughts on it? It's a pretty amazing book. It's worthwhile to read. It's changed the course of history as well as pop culture for generations to come. I haven't even read Dracula, but I did Frankenstein. Cool! I did Frankenstein for a project in 10th grade. I dressed up as Dr. Stein from Soul Eater because all the modern representations of Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster are really fascinating stuff. So, the book is written in this very odd prose style when Frankenstein's monster finally starts speaking. He's this reanimated corpse. He's been given life by this young punk who doesn't know what he's doing, but he wants to create life. He's scientifically and morbidly curious, and when his creation comes to life and he immediately sees what he's done, this being Victor Frankenstein, when Victor sees what he's done and how absolutely horrifying it is, and that he made a huge mistake, he rejects his creation on sight and then leaves his creature to wander the forest, speaking this very eloquent prose for some reason. The anecdotes that the monster gives are really fascinating, and as we all know by now, Frankenstein is not the name of the monster. It is Frankenstein's monster. The monster is nameless. He is just a young fetus in this grown-up big world that is immediately frightened by him, and he has no idea how to take it. And it's a very sad existence, but, you know, in the writing, Mary Shelley describes, you know, the settings of this voyage Victor takes and how he learns Arabic and how he starts getting schooled and pursuing education, and then how he finds the gumption to create life. I genuinely do forget how that starts. It's been a few years. It's a worthwhile read. The fascinating origins of the story have come from Mary Shelley sitting around a fire with her friends inventing a story. I'm not sure how true that is, but I'm all for the girl power. She calls this story the Modern Prometheus because Prometheus was the Greek myth, or reality if you want to believe that. It was the story of, you know, man being given fire by the gods and misusing the power and whatnot. So this is obviously Victor Frankenstein's story of how he is giving life and creating life where he really shouldn't have. And it's kind of a story about hubris and pride and how this creation he's made follows him to the ends of the earth. Literally, it ends in this icy climate. You know, the climactic battle or the final confrontation between Victor and his monster, or his creation. This poor creation has been so broken and dejected by society, he does not know where to go. His father rejected him, And so now he takes out his, uncontrollable feelings and anger onto innocent victims. And Frankenstein's monster does what he can to torture his creator by killing his wife and his child. Spoilers, sorry. But I mean, the way it gets so intense and the way it builds, because this creature has such resentment, is really fascinating. I recommend reading the prosy parts that the monster reads out loud, because it's just very eloquent and it really does put you there. He talks about how he travels to a blind man's house and the blind man treats him with such sympathy and compassion, but he, upon feeling his face, upon the blind man feeling the monster's face, is immediately reviled and horrified. And he can't find a niche or compassion really anywhere because he's being judged, so he retaliates with violence. It's a sad, heartbreaking story that I think many humans obviously can find some relatability. We've all been dejected at some point in our lives. We've all been alone. We've been rejected by people we want to embrace us, and we've all retaliated, or at least we felt some deep, harbored anger. It's a very good not a creation myth, what was I going to say? It's a very good story on trying to give life and create life when you are so out of your league and you ought to leave that creation to the big leagues. It's a good story about hubris, pride, and surprisingly very human emotions that we can all relate to. I recommend it entirely. The prosy speech that Frankenstein's monster is given may be jarring. I believe that had something to do with Mary Shelley's husband at the time editing or writing the book. And he also changed her initial ending, which is much more like hopeless as opposed to ambiguous. And that's all I'll say on that matter. Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, an amazing book, very worthwhile. It's a long, lengthy read, but I think once you hit the middle, you're going to be engrossed. The beginning is a bit of a plod. You're trying to see this person, Victor, through his life story, but I think it's a very worthwhile read. Everyone can find some relatability to it, and especially if you cover it in a class, it makes it more fascinating. You're able to break down the chunks. Look up Spark Notes if you want to get to the good stuff. But again, I think I would recommend it more than any other monster, because it's a very tragic tale, unlike what is portrayed in the media of just this green monster with bolts in his neck. I unfortunately have not seen Boris Karloff's portrayal of Frankenstein. It's iconic. It's what gave the monster in pop culture his iconic look, the bolts, the big square head, and the stitches. A bit more cartoony looking, but it's very iconic and relatable, as opposed to the long jet black hair stitched together man we have in the book. Woo! And that's all I have to say on one of my favorite books to read about, Frankenstein, aka The Modern Prometheus. Thanks for listening. And thank you, Chris, for having such an amazing channel, doing what you love, and reading and reviewing all these cool books. Horror is a fascinating genre. It's more relatable and sad and deep and romantic than people care to admit. It's not just for shock value. It's very much a critique on the human condition, and I recommend Frankenstein to anyone who wants to read a long, lengthy tale.
So when it comes to Frankenstein, the question is this horror or is this science fiction? Now, Mary, first and foremost, wanted this to be a scary story, which is the context in which it was written. They were all at the Via Dietati, Lord Byron, her husband, all these people. And there was a big challenge to do a ghost story. But what people don't realize is Mary, in her infinite wisdom, accidentally created a new genre with this, and that genre is sci-fi. This is more or less the first sci-fi story, because the whole concept of using electricity, using science to bring somebody back from the dead, to change up biology, it's pretty innovative, and nobody had ever utilized an idea like that quite before. And I mean, just the way that Victor is written early in the story, where he's, fascinated with these old alchemists, like, I think it's Paracelsus, and he kind of lords himself over these texts that people don't even take seriously anymore. It's more just outdated concepts, but he loves the ambition of them, and he loves what he feels like is a wondrousness of science that got lost by the time that he's going to school in Geneva. So, up until he gets this concept to undo death and essentially played God. It's almost like you're reading a straightforward sci-fi story. That's when the horror kicks in for real, is when for the first time he sees his creation there, you know, in the night, past the curtain on his bed, the yellow face and the fucked up skin and everything. That's really where things start to get scary. And it's almost kind of jarring, as much as the opening kind of sets up how everything's going to go full circle. But you can't understate Mary as a writer, and there's a reason she's kind of one of my favorite classic authors. Is just really good, well executed concepts that were simple but also kind of made people rethink what you could do with stories. With the story of Victor, it just comes down to not a guy who's necessarily even had a god complex. It was more just a morbid fascination and a curiosity, and it's a curiosity that ultimately ends up fucking him over pretty hard with what he creates. And what he creates is a creature who does not, and I guess to some degree cannot, experience love, and it angers the creation, and it makes him lash out and decide that, I think the line is, if he can't give hope or he can't have love, instead he's going to cause fear. Which, I mean, I think to a lot of us that's kind of a reasonable reaction. It's funny that he got kind of typecast as a monster, and it kind of makes you rethink how we think of monsters, because he's very empathetic, the creation. He's very worldly after a while. He's not around for very long until he starts kind of almost becoming a philosopher to some degree, figuring out what his role in the world is, and the way that people treat him, and, you know, how he's going to operate as this outsider. And I think a lot of people can relate to that, just feeling like you're instantly everybody's enemy no matter where you go. But yeah, Mary is one of my all-time favorites. She wrote a brilliant story that still has an effect today. And honestly, I like the way that they reinterpret it for every generation. We get a new one, you know, every like 10 years or so. And it's just great to see a story that's basically become folklore get reinterpreted over and over again in all these interesting ways. And it's just going to keep going on forever.
Okay, so let's talk Frankenstein. Frankenstein is, of course, a classic novel that I never read until I was in college. I was very aware of the Universal classic film, of course, but for whatever reason had never really been interested in reading the novel. It was assigned in college, and I ended up really loving it. It was one of my favorite things I was ever assigned to read in a college course. You know, it had a lot of differences from the movie, of course, particularly in the portrayal of the monster himself. He was very sort of almost sophisticated. He was very intelligent. He was very articulate. The movie portrayed him as sort of minimally functional, but in the book, the monster was very intelligent, which made him, I thought, an even more tragic figure, because he could think and feel and speak just like us, and yet he was isolated and alone and rejected by his own creator, Victor Frankenstein. And what I also thought was interesting about the book was that the character of Victor Frankenstein, to me, he almost comes across more villainous than the monster, because of his weakness, because of his fear, and because of his refusal to accept the consequences of his actions. And I really think in a lot of ways that was the point, the sort of theme that Mary Shelley was exploring in her novel Frankenstein. That, you know, science can be great. It has the potential for advances that make life better, but it also has the potential for a lot of negative things, and that scientists need to be cognizant of that, and they also need to be willing to accept the consequences of what they are doing. They need to think about what those consequences are going to be before they act, and once they act, they need to take and accept the consequences of what they have done. Victor Frankenstein was not willing to do that, which in a way led to all the tragedy that befell him and those close to him. And I like how like the movie ends with the mob chasing the monster, but in the book, the monster is pursuing Victor. And the ending where he finally catches up with him, sort of in an Arctic wasteland, is very effective. I think anyone who doesn't read it because they think classic literature is boring or something like that, they're really missing out. I really recommend you read this novel because it is a wonderful and very effective piece of storytelling. And even though the classic Universal film, veers off from the source material, I also think that is a really good adaptation, and it still touches on the themes that Mary Shelley introduced in the novel. I know in the 90s, I think it was, Kenneth Branagh made a version with Robert De Niro as the monster that I've heard was a little closer to the novel, and yet I've never watched that one. The 70s, of course, gave us the Mel Brooks parody Young Frankenstein, which I haven't seen that in a while, but I loved it as a kid. And Frankenstein has been used in countless other films. I mean, it really is a horror movie icon. And all thanks to Mary Shelley and this novel that she wrote. I really think it is a worthwhile read, and I think everyone should check it out.
Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is one of the greatest novels to ever exist. And more than that, it's one of the greatest horror novels to ever exist. It's up there with Dracula, it's up there with Hell House, it's up there with The Invisible Man, it's up there with War of the Worlds and The Haunting of Hill House. Just a really classic horror novel. It's just beautiful all the way through. The best thing about it is that if you watch the 1938 movie, I think it was 1938, Frankenstein movie, you think you know Frankenstein, but when you read the novel, you realize you don't know Frankenstein at all. Frankenstein is just one, the book has him being so much more philosophical and so much more smarter. Actually, he talks and he acts like a person, someone who's trying to find their place in society but can't. And he's so rage-filled because he was created by this mad scientist, and now he just doesn't, he just hates his existence, and he wants the scientist to pay for what he's done. And I think it's fantastic. It's a beautiful novel, and it is really creepy, really scary, because, it warns you about the horrors of science, the horrors of just recklessly doing stuff that we know is against nature. Just creating stuff that shouldn't be created, messing with stuff like death, trying to stop death and all that, and basically be God. And I think that the novel really does bring that message across greatly. I think it does a great job at doing that. I think it is fantastic. The writing is brilliant all the way through. It's written like it's written like Dracula. I almost said it's written like Frankenstein. It's written like Dracula, where it has notes. It's about diary entries and stuff like that. It's not a narrative all the way through. It's different narratives put together to equal one book, and that works just fine. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful book. Frankenstein himself is a very tragic figure, as most of the classic monsters are, and I love that about him, that we can not necessarily root for him, but we can feel for him. We can understand him and understand why he is the way he is. And I know people are going to say his name is not Frankenstein, his name is Adam. I get it, but here's the thing. For me personally, my problem with that is, I know his name is Adam, but even if his name was Adam, his last name would be Frankenstein. Why? Because his father is Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein. So I call him Frankenstein because of that. If he is the son of his father, he is Frankenstein too. So I always just call him Frankenstein. But anyway, yeah, he is a fantastic character. Dr. Frankenstein himself is a great character. He is also sympathetic as well, but you kind of get angry at him because he's the one who started this whole mess. Because of his ego, because of his recklessness, this whole thing starts. So he's the villain and also the hero of the story. And you could say the same thing about the monster. He is the villain and the hero of the story. There is no real black and white in this story. It's completely gray, and that's my favorite kind of story, is when there are no morals, meaning no clear morals. There's no, this is good, this is bad. It's kind of like, okay, both sides have points to them. There's you can understand both points and you can understand both sides to some degree. I think that's great. So, yeah, the novel's fantastic. Definitely check this novel out. It's great. It's really short. So if if you don't like to read old classics, because a lot of them are really long, this one's really short and it's a great read and you won't get bored at all. And yeah, I highly recommend it, and thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, is a fantastic novel that explores the idea that sometimes achieving greatness isn't worth the price you pay for it. This novel also explores themes such as what happens when you abuse science and judging someone solely for their physical appearance. I'm going to be going in depth with this review, so spoiler alert. One of the things I really like about the novel is the constant sense of dread throughout. You know right from the get-go that this is not a happy story, and it just gets darker as it progresses. It starts out with Captain Robert Walton writing letters to his sister from his ship that's currently sailing in the Arctic Sea. He and his crew find Victor Frankenstein and try to nurse him back to health, while Frankenstein tells the story of how he created a monster due to his own ambitions of scientific achievement. I really liked how Frankenstein's ambition mirrors Walton's own ambition to make new discoveries. Walton's journey is treacherous, and some of his crew perish due to the harsh conditions, so in the end he decides to turn the ship around, which I believe is due in large part to hearing Frankenstein's story of what can happen when you try to cross certain lines that people were not meant to cross. There's a line early in the book in which Victor says to Captain Walton, "I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I then was, to your destruction and infallible misery. Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow." I think that quote perfectly sums up one of the morals of this story, which is that sometimes it's better to be content with what you're naturally expected to do rather than try to exceed the bounds of that. The story that Frankenstein tells is absolutely thrilling to read and gives great detail about his life before the monster came into it. He had a happy life up until his mother died from scarlet fever, which she caught from his adopted cousin Elizabeth. I would say that her death is the start of the gloom of Victor's story and contributes to him going down the destructive path of creating the monster. I really liked how Mary Shelley described Victor's preparation in creating it and how it took over his life. She brilliantly describes a man obsessed with playing God, and I liked how she also showed Victor to be somewhat arrogant in that he wants to create a new species that will know him as its creator, only to later realize that he's created a hideous abomination that becomes a monster. And speaking of the monster, he's a fascinating character too. A being who was forcefully brought into a world that he didn't understand and that didn't understand him. One of Mary Shelley's strengths as a writer was her skill with description, and the way she describes the monster's appearance is both grotesque and fascinating. I thought that the description of the monster having skin that barely covered the muscles and blood vessels underneath was perfectly horrific. He's so hideous that Victor turns away from it in disgust. He abandons it, and it's left to fend for itself. The monster is shunned by people due to his ugliness, but eventually learns to read and speak due to living in close proximity to an impoverished family living in a cottage. I felt sorry for the monster due to the fact that people recoil in horror and even try to attack it due to his appearance, even though he starts out as an innocent being. He becomes fully capable of articulating himself in an intelligent way, and even manages to befriend the blind member of the family until his enraged son Felix comes home. At one point, he even saves a girl from drowning, only to be shot by her father. This all ties into the novel's theme of not judging someone by their appearance. He only truly becomes a monster when other people treat him horribly because of his appearance. At the end of the novel, the monster says, "For a while I destroyed his hopes. I did not satisfy my own desires. They were forever ardent and craving. Still I desired love and fellowship, and I was still spurned. Was there no injustice in this? Am I to be thought the only criminal?" The monster is indeed a tragic character. He longs to be accepted in a world in which he is unacceptable. However, the monster loses sympathy when he murders Victor's younger brother William and then frames the servant Justine for it. It's at that moment that the monster truly becomes as ugly on the inside as he is on the outside. Of course, that's not to say that Victor isn't at all to blame. After all, he created it and abandoned it when it needed him. Another one of the novel's themes is abusing science. Victor abuses it to try and play God, and it causes his own destruction, as well as the destruction of everyone he loves. Everything that the monster does is on Victor's hands, especially when he breaks his promise to the monster to create a mate for him. In my opinion, that was like the ultimate betrayal, because while, yes, the monster had lost sympathy at this point, I still understood his anguish, and if he had someone to share his life with, he probably would have been happy and wouldn't have hurt anyone else, but Victor took that chance away, and in doing so brought the monster's wrath upon himself. The whole novel is really a hell of Victor's own making, and its culmination is suitably sad, with the monster mourning over Victor's dead body. I liked how even though the two had a very antagonistic relationship, the monster still had a very small amount of respect for Victor, and it was enough for him to pay his respects, and even admit that he felt remorse when killing Victor's loved ones. I think that that brings the monster's character full circle. He started out as an innocent being who was shunned by society, who became intelligent, and then through being further rejected by society, became evil, and then with the death of his creator, realized that he needed to be destroyed. All in all, I really love this book. It's a tragic tale and a cautionary one. Dr. Frankenstein is exactly like Prometheus, trying to steal fire from the gods, and in doing so, he gets horribly burnt. It's no wonder why there have been so many adaptations of this novel, and that it stood the test of time. It really is a great story, and one that will never be forgotten.
So, I hope you enjoyed my friend's short reviews on this book. Now, Frankenstein has had countless adaptations of it, and I'm not going to be able to touch on every single adaptation. It's just impossible, but I'm going to try to touch on as many of the Frankenstein adaptations as I can. Now, of course, when the novel was first published, movies did not exist, but there were various different plays made based on Frankenstein that came out only a few years after the book was first published. The first of these plays was a play called Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein. But the first film adaptation of Frankenstein came out in 1910, and it was directed by J. Sherrill Dolly, and I'm sure I'm not saying his name right, but a lot of people mistakenly think that Thomas Edison directed that movie because it was made by Thomas Edison's company, and the movie has actually been called Thomas Edison's Frankenstein. But the 1910 version of Frankenstein is a really interesting little horror film. It's only about 13 minutes long. By today's standards, it would be considered a short film, but I do actually recommend it, and it's probably the only Frankenstein movie where the monster is actually created in an oven, and you could easily watch it on YouTube. Now, last Halloween, I actually put together a condensed version of Frankenstein 1910, which I used as one of the segments for a short anthology film I did last year called Silent Tales. There was also a 1915 adaptation called Life Without Soul, as well as another adaptation in 1920 called The Monster of Frankenstein. Both of these movies are now considered to be lost. Now, the most famous adaptation of Frankenstein is, of course, the 1931 film from Universal Pictures, which was directed by James Whale. Now, while it is the most famous adaptation of Mary Shelley's story, the movie itself is actually only a loose adaptation. Basically, it takes the same basic idea of the book and completely does its own thing with it. But while it might not necessarily do justice to the novel, James Whale's Frankenstein is one of the most important horror films ever made. Like, it established so many different tropes that got used not just in other adaptations of Frankenstein, but throughout horror history. Now, in the film, Frankenstein was played by Colin Clive, who for some reason was called Henry Frankenstein instead of Victor. And in the film, the Frankenstein monster was played by Boris Karloff, and it's definitely the film that has come to define Karloff's career. And Boris Karloff's version of the Frankenstein monster is easily the most famous interpretation of the character, even though it's not exactly the character from the book. Like, the whole image of the Frankenstein monster having the bolts in his neck and the flat top, that's not how Mary Shelley described him in the book, yet that's what most people think of when they think the Frankenstein monster. Actually, that's what most people think of when they think Frankenstein, and I think it was the Universal film where the confusion really started, where people thought that the monster was called Frankenstein. Now, in the film, Frankenstein had a hunchback assistant named Fritz, who is not a character from the book, but he is a character from the play Presumption, which was the first play based on Mary Shelley's novel. But Fritz was played brilliantly by Dwight Frye, who previously played Renfield in Universal's adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And Fritz was sort of an early precursor for the character of Igor. The movie also has the iconic line when the monster is first coming to life, where Frankenstein cries out, "It's alive," and that's a line that has become so associated with Frankenstein that I'm sure there's some people who probably think that line's from the book. But my favorite part of the line is actually what he says right after "It's alive." He cries out, "In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God." And that line was actually pretty controversial at the time, and was even cut out of some versions of the film. And the movie was actually considered to be quite shocking for its time. Now, everybody remembers the scene where Frankenstein's monster accidentally kills the little girl, but then it cuts to the girl's father carrying her dead body through the town square, and that scene, even by today's standards, is still pretty horrific. Now, the 1931 version of Frankenstein had a sequel in 1935 called The Bride of Frankenstein, also directed by James Whale. And The Bride of Frankenstein actually does follow the book a little bit more than the first movie did. For example, Mary Shelley is actually a character in the opening scene of the movie, where she's played by Elsa Lanchester, who also played the monster's bride in the film. And also, the whole concept of the monster demanding a female counterpart is something taken directly from the novel. And also in the movie, the monster learns how to speak, however, he never becomes quite as intelligent as he was in the novel. Also in the movie, there's a scene where the monster befriends a blind hermit, which was obviously based on the subplot from the novel dealing with the Delancey family. But The Bride of Frankenstein is an excellent movie, and I do think it's better than the first one. And the movie's also noted for its gay undertones, because James Whale, who directed both that and the first one, was an openly gay man, and one of the few openly gay directors at that time. Now, James Whale's life was the basis for the 1995 Christopher Bram novel Father of Frankenstein, which was made into the brilliant 1998 drama film Gods and Monsters. Now, the third film of Universal's Frankenstein series was 1939's Son of Frankenstein, which was the last time that Boris Karloff played the Frankenstein monster. That movie also introduced the character of Igor, who in the film was played by Bela Lugosi, who you could say was loosely based on the character of Fritz from the first movie. But Igor has gone on to become a very iconic character in his own right. Now, Son of Frankenstein was followed by The Ghost of Frankenstein in 1942, and then that was followed by Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 1943, which was also a sequel to Universal's 1941 film, The Wolfman. And in a lot of ways, you could say that that was the first crossover movie ever made. Now, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman had a direct sequel in 1944 called House of Frankenstein, which also featured Count Dracula. The Frankenstein monster would also appear in 1945's The House of Dracula. Now, the final film of Universal's Frankenstein series was the 1948 horror comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which many critics consider to be the finest horror comedy ever made. In that movie, comedians Bud Abbott and Lou Costello played these two bumble and baggage clerks who cross paths with Dracula, the Wolfman, and the Frankenstein monster. Now, British film studio Hammer did their own adaptation of Frankenstein in 1957 called The Curse of Frankenstein. Now, while that movie might not be as historically significant as the Universal film, it did kick off Hammer's cycle of gothic horror films, which is what they're best known for. And in that movie, Peter Cushing played Victor Frankenstein and basically played Frankenstein as a sociopath. And in that film, Christopher Lee played the creature. Now, the creature is pretty much a lumbering brute throughout, but I actually think Christopher Lee could have played the novel's version of the creature really well. Now, The Curse of Frankenstein spawned a series of sequels. Now, unlike the Universal series, which primarily focused on the monster, the Hammer films primarily focused on Frankenstein himself, and actually it was a different monster in each of the sequels. But you had The Revenge of Frankenstein in 1958, then you had The Evil of Frankenstein in 1964, that was followed by Frankenstein Created Woman in 1967, and then that was followed by Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed in 1969, and that was followed by The Horror of Frankenstein in 1970, which was the only one of the Hammer films that did not have Peter Cushing as Frankenstein. That one was made as sort of a loose remake of The Curse of Frankenstein. And the final, and actually my favorite of the Hammer Frankenstein films, was 1974's Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Now, I do want to point out that the Hammer Frankenstein films are also my favorite interpretations of the Frankenstein story, even though none of them really follow the book at all. Now, to go back to the 50s, besides the first two films of the Hammer Frankenstein series, you had a few low-budget Frankenstein films that really owe nothing to the Mary Shelley novel other than the name and some vague plot similarities. Like, you had 1957's I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, which had a sequel called How to Make a Monster. How to Make a Monster actually had a remake in 2001, but as far as I know, that was an in-name only remake. You also had Frankenstein 1970 and 1958, which ironically had Boris Karloff playing Dr. Frankenstein. That same year, there was a film called Frankenstein's Daughter, and around that same time, there was a movie called Tales of Frankenstein. In 1965, you had a film called Frankenstein Meets the Space Monster. Some of these movies would probably cause Mary Shelley to turn in her grave. In 1965, Japanese film company Toho, the same company that produced all the Godzilla movies, did their own Frankenstein movie called Frankenstein Conquers the World, which was directed by Ishiro Honda, who directed some of the best Godzilla movies. In that movie, Frankenstein's monster grows to the size of a kaiju, and he battles a dinosaur-like creature called Baragon, who would actually show up in two of the Godzilla movies. Unfortunately, Toho's version of Frankenstein never showed up in any of the Godzilla films, which is a shame because it would have been really cool to actually have a Godzilla vs. Frankenstein monster movie. But Frankenstein Conquers the World had a sequel in 1966 called War of the Gargantuas, also directed by Ishiro Honda. There was a film called Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter in 1966. Yeah, that was a thing. Frankenstein's monster also appeared in the James Bond spoof Casino Royale. In the 1970s, you had films like Dracula vs. Frankenstein and Lady Frankenstein. You also had a few made-for-TV Frankenstein films like Frankenstein, The True Story, and I know Dan Curtis did a Frankenstein film around that same time. You had the blaxploitation film Blackenstein. You had Andy Warhol's Flesh for Frankenstein. You had the brilliant Mel Brooks comedy Young Frankenstein in 1974, which was a spoof on the first 3 Universal Frankenstein films. The Rocky Horror Picture Show was also sort of a loose parody on the Frankenstein story. I mean, you had Tim Curry's character of Dr. Frankenfurter, obviously a reference to Frankenstein. There was also a 1984 made-for-TV adaptation of Frankenstein, which had Carrie Fisher as Elizabeth. A really interesting one from 1985 that I want to talk about is The Bride, which was sort of a loose remake of The Bride of Frankenstein, but that was actually a really good movie. It was more of a romantic drama as opposed to a straight horror film, but it was a really interesting take on the whole Frankenstein story. In that movie, Sting actually played Frankenstein, who was called Charles Frankenstein in the film, and he was basically the villain of the film. Jennifer Beals played the titular bride, and Clancy Brown played the monster, who was actually called Victor in the movie. Around that same time, there was a comedy called Transylvania 65000, which used some elements of the Frankenstein story. Now, in George Romero's Day of the Dead, which was the 3rd film of his Night of the Living Dead series, you had the character of Dr. Logan, who was constantly nicknamed Dr. Frankenstein throughout that film. And you could tell that the character of Bub, the zombie who was starting to gain human intelligence, was kind of supposed to be a parallel to the Frankenstein monster. There are also a lot of Frankenstein references in the 6th Friday the 13th movie, Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. The Frankenstein monster also showed up in one of my favorite 80s cult classics, The Monster Squad, which was a tribute to the Universal monster films. In that movie, the monster was played by Tom Noonan, who people might recognize as Francis Dollarhide in Manhunter. In 1990, there was a Roger Corman film called Frankenstein Unbound, which I know was based on a novel from the 70s of the same name. But that was an interesting sort of metafiction take on the Frankenstein story. It was about a time traveler who was accidentally sent back to Mary Shelley's time, but it turns out that Frankenstein and the creature and several other characters from the Frankenstein novel were real, and Mary Shelley was basing her novel off of real events, so basically you had characters from the original novel, as well as people like Mary Shelley and Lord Byron and Percy Shelley as actual characters in the movie. And the main character actually banged Mary Shelley at one point, which is kind of hilarious. You had the 1990 Frank Henenlotter film Frankenhooker. There was another made-for-TV adaptation in 1992. Now, one of the few Frankenstein adaptations that actually follows the book is the 1994 film from Kenneth Branagh. Now, that was produced by Francis Ford Coppola, and it was coming off the heels of Coppola's 1992 adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. That movie was also co-written by Frank Darabont, who I think is an amazing screenwriter, and Darabont has said that the script he wrote for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was one of the best things he's ever written. However, the movie itself turned out to be one of the worst movies he's ever seen, according to him. Like, he was not happy with what Kenneth Branagh did to his script. Now, I have very mixed opinions on Kenneth Branagh's adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I just rewatched it the other night, and there are some things in that movie that I think are brilliant, and then there are some things in that movie that I thought were absolutely eye-rolling. The movie suffered from a lot of overacting, which made it unintentionally hokey. And while the movie definitely followed the book more than other adaptations did, it didn't necessarily do justice to the book. Like, it would just gloss over certain things from the novel. Like, all the stuff with the Delancey family in the movie is nowhere near as moving or as impactful as it was in the novel. And in that movie, Kenneth Branagh played Frankenstein. Now, despite some scenes where he is overacting, overall I will say that he was actually really good in the role. Helena Bonham Carter played Elizabeth, and Ian Holm played Frankenstein's father. And perhaps the most polarizing thing about that movie was Robert De Niro as the creature. Now, after rewatching the movie, honestly, I actually think Robert De Niro did a pretty good job in that movie, and he did definitely try to capture the spirit of the character from the novel. Like, a lot of people made fun of it at the time, because at the time Robert De Niro was really starting to get typecast in a lot of gangster films, like Martin Scorsese's movies, but honestly, I give him a lot of credit for trying to do something different. And overall, I would say Kenneth Branagh's Frankenstein is an interesting failure. There was a 1997 made-for-TV movie called House of Frankenstein. There was an Alvin and the Chipmunks movie called Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet Frankenstein, which I used to watch all the time when I was a little kid. There was a superhero comedy called Mystery Men, and the main villain of that movie was basically Dr. Frankenstein. Frankenstein's monster also showed up in the 2004 film Van Helsing. That same year, there was a made-for-TV adaptation of Frankenstein that, from what I hear, is actually relatively true to the book. Frankenstein's monster also showed up in the children's film Hotel Transylvania, which was a spoof on the Universal monster films. He also showed up in the sequels to that. In 2013, there was a Nazi zombie film called Frankenstein's Army. In 2014, there was a film called I, Frankenstein, which was a really stupid freaking movie. Basically, it was about Frankenstein's monster getting caught up in a battle between demons and gargoyles are supposed to be like the spawns of angels. Now, technically, the idea of a Frankenstein movie that deals with a battle between angels and demons is kind of apt, given all the parallels that the original novel had with Paradise Lost. But that was a dumb freaking movie. That was a really, really dumb movie. I will say Aaron Eckhart actually did a pretty good job as Frankenstein's monster, but overall the movie was pretty freaking stupid. In 2015, there was a film called Victor Frankenstein where James McAvoy played Frankenstein and Daniel Radcliffe played Igor. That same year, Bernard Rose, who directed Candyman, did sort of a modern-day take on Frankenstein. There was also a film called Depraved from 2019 that was sort of a modern-day take on Frankenstein. I'm intentionally skipping over a lot of other films that have used the Frankenstein name or have used certain ideas from Frankenstein, because honestly it's just too many to name. Like, there had to have been at least 100 different movies made based on Mary Shelley's novel. Now, in terms of television, you had the character of Herman Munster from The Munsters, who was a pretty overt parody of Universal's version of the Frankenstein monster. Frankenstein's monster also appeared as a villain on the Power Rangers. Both Frankenstein and his creature appeared as reoccurring characters on the show Penny Dreadful. Recently, you had the show The Frankenstein Chronicles, and you also had the adult animated series Mary Shelley's Frankenhole. God only knows what Mary Shelley would think of that if she were to somehow come back from the dead in modern times. There have also been various different comic books inspired by Mary Shelley's story, like both Marvel and DC Comics have their own versions of the Frankenstein monster. And in speaking of DC Comics, there is a villain in the Swamp Thing comics called the Patchwork Man, who is clearly drawn to look like Universal's version of the Frankenstein monster. Junji Ito also did a manga adaptation of Frankenstein that actually follows the original novel pretty closely. Mike Mignola also did a series of Frankenstein comics I believe are in the same universe as his Hellboy comics. Dean Koontz also did a series of books based on Frankenstein that he co-wrote with Kevin J. Anderson, and those books were actually adapted into a 2004 made-for-TV movie. And pretty much any story you could think of that deals with science gone wrong or man trying to play God and it has disastrous consequences probably owes something to Frankenstein. Stuff like Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park or movies like Splice or Ex Machina. Actually, the character of David, the android from the two Alien prequels, Prometheus and Alien Covenant, reminds me a lot of Frankenstein's creature in the novel. Now, Mary Shelley's life, or specifically the summer where she conceived the idea of Frankenstein, has been fictionalized in several movies, like Ken Russell's 1986 film, Gothic. Another interesting film was 1988's Rowan in the Wind, which was a fictionalized version of Mary Shelley's life, but it involved the Frankenstein monster actually coming to life and essentially representing the Grim Reaper coming for her friends and family. That same year, there was a movie called Haunted Summer, which dealt with the same subject matter, although, as far as I know, there were no supernatural elements in that one. I think that was more of a straight drama about the summer that Mary Shelley conceived the idea of Frankenstein. And in 2017, there was a straight biopic on Mary Shelley that, unfortunately, I heard wasn't very good, which is a shame because, honestly, if you look at Mary Shelley's life, there are aspects of her life that would make a very interesting movie. Now, I'm sure there's probably always gonna be Frankenstein movies. For as long as there are movies, they're gonna try to do adaptations of Frankenstein, whether they're straight adaptations or movies that go completely in their own direction, like, honestly, most Frankenstein movies. Now, I know Guillermo del Toro wanted to do a Frankenstein movie, which I would love to see, but honestly, one person who I would love to see adapt Frankenstein is Robert Eggers, the guy who directed The Witch and The Lighthouse. I think he would do a really good Frankenstein adaptation, because his movies, as pretentious as this is gonna sound, really do feel like literature on film, and his usage of metaphor, like, I could totally see him doing a Frankenstein adaptation and doing it well. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to my friend Chris, who you heard from before, giving his thoughts on some of the Frankenstein adaptations, namely the 2011 Danny Boyle stage production. After that, you'll hear from my friend Jeremy giving his thoughts on the 1931 James Whale film.
Obviously, we have the James Whale movies. This story's been redone so many times. It's gotten to the point where, honestly, it's just cool to see, like, your favorite actor, your favorite director work on it and, like, give their own idea. You know, like, I love what Mike Mignola did with it. I love, there was a comic book by Chuck Dixon called Joe Frankenstein. That was a really good time. It was a lot like, what was that movie? The Monster Squad. But I think my personal favorite, and that's saying a lot, is there was a play in 2011 by Danny Boyle, where Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller one would play the creation, one would play Victor, and then, like, every other performance, they would switch roles. And it was pretty bomb. It was pretty amazing. It was very well produced, very well directed. And I loved that relationship between creator and created, and the idea of the two of them being interchangeable, and kind of seeing the effect that the two of them have on each other. Because there's a symbiosis no matter what you do when you create something, whether it be, you know, something biological or something creative, or even, you know, like something like building a house. There's a relationship you have to that thing now that you've brought it into the world, and there is a responsibility and a respect. And the dark side of that play is, if that respect does not go both ways, it's inevitably going to breed to hate. And it's so fascinating to think about, that psychological aspect of the story. That's what really got me about Danny's play. And what's really fascinating, honestly, is just to get to see Benedict and Johnny Lee Miller put their stamp on the characters. So that is definitely my favorite adaptation out of all of them. A very close second is Bernie Wrightson's graphic novel adaptation, and I think he wrote a sequel called Alive Alive. That is the best that story is going to get in comic book form, because Bernie Wrightson is a master of what he does.
Frankenstein is one of my all-time favorite movies. It is one of the greatest horror movies ever made. I mean, it is just an absolute classic. It's got a great story, a great cast, perfectly eerie scenes of darkness and gloom, and it just gives us this amazing character in the monster, played by the legendary Boris Karloff. Boris Karloff was an amazing actor. I mean, in the role of the monster, he was able to say so much while saying so incredibly little. You know, he doesn't have any lines in this first movie other than, of course, the grunting, a lot of times in anger. But also, you can tell that he's giving the monster a lot of depth with just the way he moves and the way he looks and, the way he kind of, sort of silently begs for sympathy in some scenes. The scene where I think, one of my favorite scenes is just where he's first introduced and, you see him from the back at first, but then he turns around slowly and, it gives you that sort of eerie stare. And the camera does a close-up on his face. I mean, I can't imagine how audiences in 1931 reacted to that. I mean, that must have been terrifying. I also love in that same scene when he sees the light for the first time and he tries to, reach it and grab it. It's like him trying to sort of explore this new world that he's been thrust into. And I think that's a very effective scene as well, as is the scene of him with little Maria later on. I mean, that scene is just so tender and so heartbreaking, because the monster obviously doesn't mean to cause any harm to the girl. He just, he doesn't know any better. He thinks that she'll float just like the flowers. And of course, he learns a very harsh lesson in that, obviously she won't and doesn't. They originally cut that scene, or part of that scene, the part where he throws her in the lake, I guess because they thought it was too gruesome at the time, which just made the monster appear more monstrous, because I think the way it played out was it showed him reaching for her, and then it just immediately cut to the father carrying her dead body in the town. Which, I'm glad they eventually restored the scene years later, because it shows, what actually happened and that the monster, wasn't as vicious. I also love watching the scene where the monster is first created. You see all the electrical equipment and it's, you hear the sound of the storm outside and it's very, the scenery is great, this dark, laboratory high up in, I guess, the mountains or wherever. It's just a great setting for a horror film. Set design for these old horror classics was just perfect. And, seeing the monster's lifeless body on the table is just so, it's pretty creepy. And then, of course, when he is brought down and he starts to move and you see the hand move very slowly, and then of course Dr. Frankenstein goes, "It's alive, it's alive, oh, now I know how it feels to be God." That line, about him saying about how it feels to be God was also cut in the original release because they thought people would think it would be blasphemy. But that's just, Colin Clive was an amazing actor as well, and he was sadly, he died too soon because of his alcoholism at only 37, but in the short time he did live, he gave us some magnificent performances, and of course, his performance as Dr. Frankenstein is definitely his most famous and memorable one. The movie definitely deviates a lot from Mary Shelley's novel, but I think the spirit of it is definitely still there. The themes are definitely still there, of what happens when you abuse science and you try to play God, and also judging someone solely by the way they look. I do wonder, though, why the heck they had to change the names of, Victor Frankenstein and Henry Clerval, to, they switched them around. It's like, what the hell was the point of that? But, that's just a real minor gripe I have with the movie. Otherwise, this movie is a horror masterpiece in my eyes, and it always will be. Loved it ever since I was a kid, and I still love it now. Frankenstein monster has always been my favorite monster, because he just has such depth to him. He's a tragic figure. Even though, of course, there's no excusing, the horrible things he does, both in the novel and in the films, the killing and all that. He still... he didn't want to be here on this earth. He was forced to be here by, his creator. So, that in that sense, yes, he is a very tragic figure, and he does long for friendship, which is also explored further in Bride of Frankenstein. And, it's constantly denied him, which is especially sad. One more thing I want to mention before I wrap up this review is I just love the character of Baron Frankenstein, Henry's father. I mean, he's so funny, and yet he's such an asshole as well. I just love the first scene he's in, where he's just, the Burgermeister comes to, greet him and ask him about the wedding of his son and Elizabeth. And the Burgermeister goes, "Oh, well, the villagers have already prepared." And, he just goes, "Oh, well, tell them to unprepare." He's just, and he calls him an idiot and this and that. But my favorite part of him is just later on when I think he's having this little party, and he has this special, wine drink, and he says to one of the servants, "Give the servants or maids some champagne. This stuff's too good for them." That always makes me crack up laughing. Dwight Fry as Fritz is also great to watch. He's such a scoundrel, the kind that, of course, Dr. Frankenstein would probably hire to work for him. One thing I don't get is that, why the hell does he come with a freaking torch to terrify the monster, even though the monster wasn't even doing anything wrong at the time? It's like, why would you do that? But even so, he's an entertaining character. And, there's also a bit of, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, it's very satisfying when he gets his comeuppance for torturing the poor monster. He's like almost that character you love to hate, almost, I would say. So that's another great part of the film, Dwight Fry's performance as Fritz. And the climactic scene at the windmill, and the villagers setting it on fire, and, Dr. Frankenstein confronting the creature he created. It's just an epic battle. I just love the look the monster gives him. It's like silently saying, "Why did you do this to me? Bring me into this world that wouldn't understand me and that I wouldn't understand." And, the rage that Boris Karloff imbues into the monster in that scene when he's trying to strangle Dr. Frankenstein is just absolutely perfect. Bride of Frankenstein is another great horror masterpiece, and also another one of my favorite horror movies. It brings back a great cast. Well, almost everyone. The role of Elizabeth was played by Valerie Hobson instead of Mae Clark. But, you've got Boris Karloff back as the monster, Colin Clive back as Henry Frankenstein, and newly added to the cast is the great Ernest Thesiger as the evil Dr. Pretorius, and he is just fantastic. He injects such a sadistic glee into his role that's just so enjoyable to watch. They use a little more from Mary Shelley's novel in this one. They include the monster being able to speak, although he's still not as intelligent as he was in the novel, but he's a little more intelligent than he was in the first film. They also include a scene where he, like in the novel, gasps in horror at his reflection in the water and realizes what a hideous monstrosity he is. Also, him being friends with the blind man in the hut is similar to the monster befriending the blind father of the family he was spying on in the novel. The monster longing for a friend is a lot more prevalent in Bride of Frankenstein than it was in Frankenstein, and, it's just absolutely heartbreaking to watch, especially, the scene where he first meets the blind man and, starts to develop a relationship with him is very heartwarming to watch. And it's very, you just fall in love with the two of them when you see how they act with each other. And it makes it all the more heartbreaking when they're forcefully taken away from each other by those two dickhead hunters who happen upon the place. There's definitely still a lot of genuinely creepy moments in this film. My favorite happens to be at the beginning when the man falls into the ruins of the windmill, and he lands in the water, and you hear that deep, thumping music, and then you see the monster kind of come out from behind a corner, from behind a wall, and then, of course, strangle the poor guy. I always thought that was very creepy. And one actress who I must mention, who is one of the most over-the-top actors in the history of cinema, is the late Una O'Connor. I mean, oh my God, she brings the term over the top to a new level. When she first sees the monster, granted, anyone would probably freak out upon seeing the monster, but her reaction is just so over the top and priceless. It's just, wow. But getting back to the plot point of the monster wanting a friend, he meets Pretorius and develops a sort of friendship with him, although Dr. Pretorius is really only using him to get to Frankenstein and, get him to do his bidding. So I was always under the assumption that Pretorius didn't really think of the monster as a friend. He just thought of him as someone he could use and manipulate to, get Dr. Frankenstein to do his bidding. And that, of course, comes back to bite him in the end. I must say, though, that as much as I love this movie, it does have a bit of a plot hole in that why the hell would you have a lever that could destroy your whole laboratory at the ready in the lab? That's just... But, other than that, this is a fantastic film that I've always loved so much. Yeah, I've always loved it, and the reveal of the bride at the end is just a spectacular scene. It's got great music, which, the music throughout this movie is great, but especially in this scene with the reveal of the bride. And, again, following the heartbreak over the old man, now the monster goes through another heartbreak when the bride rejects him because of his ugliness. It's at first such a touching moment, after she first screams, but when she, sits and then he sits with her for a minute and he touches her hand, it's so soothing and so, like I said, touching. It's a very touching moment, but then, of course, she recoils in horror. And, of course, he goes, "She hate me." And that's another thing I want to bring up. The monster being able to speak in this movie, Karloff he delivers the lines so well, and he makes it so that, it's like the monster is having trouble speaking, which he would because, he's just learning to speak. In some instances when he talks, it seems like it almost hurts, which I thought was a perfect way to portray it. And before I end this review, I just want to bring up the supposed gay subtext in the film. It's always very interesting when I read about it. Some critics have suggested that, the monster and the old blind hermit's relationship, getting disrupted by the hunters is like a metaphor for, at that time, homosexual relationships being unacceptable. And it always fascinated me, that kind of sort of metaphor or allegory. And, they've also said that, Dr. Frankenstein and Pretorius could almost be seen as the bride's, same-sex parents. Which, again, it's an interesting thing to think about. I hope you've all enjoyed my review. Take care.
So that was my review on Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, and bye.